1794. Paris is eating itself alive. Inside a restaurant hearth on the Rue Saint-Honoré, a 12-year-old boy is curled up in the ashes for warmth, not a metaphor. Literally sleeping inside a fireplace because it's the only heat he can find. That boy will go on to cook for Napoleon, the Tsar of Russia, and the King of England. But before any of that, the emperors, the palaces, the dinners that shaped European diplomacy, we need to talk about why the city around that fireplace was about to tear itself apart, and how a cake shaped like a Greek temple accidentally helped ignite the most violent political uprising in modern history. But first, who was this boy, and how did he end up in that fireplace? Marie-Antoine Carême was 8 years old when his father left him on a Paris street corner in 1792. The parting words, reportedly actually spoken, were, "The world is large and full of resources for clever people." Then his father walked away. That was it. That was the whole goodbye. Paris in 1792 was not a good city to be a parentless child. The revolution was already 2 years in. The streets were violent, the bread was scarce, and the people who'd been exploited for generations were furious in the specific way that only hunger can produce. Carême survived anyway. He talked his way into a chophouse job. He slept in the hearth, 3 miles away, in the private dining rooms that survived the first wave of revolutionary chaos. The remaining aristocracy was commissioning sugar sculptures the size of armoires, centerpieces taller than a man, food as furniture. While Carême burned his hands keeping warm, someone across the city was paying a craftsman to sculpt the Colosseum out of spun sugar. Carême apprenticed under a pastry master named Sylvain Bailly, and something clicked. He became genuinely, all-consumingly obsessed with pièces montées, enormous centerpiece constructions made from sugar, pastry, and marzipan, not cakes. Architectural models, bridges, temples, Roman ruins rendered entirely in caramelized sugar. Cookbooks weren't detailed enough for what he was trying to build. So he walked to the Bibliothèque Nationale and studied actual architectural drawings. He taught himself the proportions of classical columns so his sugar temples would be structurally accurate. A teenager, teaching himself architecture. To make better pastry, the world he was training for was genuinely jaw-dropping. Aristocratic French meals ran 48 courses. The table wasn't set for dinner, it was staged like an exhibition. Whole roasted animals posed mid-stride, towers of glazed fruit 3 feet tall. Most of it was never eaten. It wasn't food, it was a statement about who you were. While Carême perfected sugar temples for the richest tables in France, the people living 3 streets away were literally dying for bread. The 1788 harvest had failed. The actual wheat crop collapsed across France. Grain merchants hoarded what was left. Bread prices spiked 88% in a single year. Wages didn't move. A working family in Paris was spending 90% of its income on bread alone. Just bread, nothing else. Meanwhile, the French government was bankrupt. Not from war losses, but from funding the American Revolution, which is its own irony, and King Louis XVI was too paralyzed by bureaucracy and ego to respond. There was no relief, no intervention. Just a king holding court at Versailles while his capital starved. You've heard the "let them eat cake" line. Marie Antoinette almost certainly never said it. The quote appears in Rousseau's writing about a different princess, decades earlier, but it spread instantly because it was completely plausible. That's the real indictment. The aristocracy had made itself so grotesque that any cruelty seemed credible. Bread wasn't a side issue to the French Revolution. It was the revolution. The storming of the Bastille happened 4 days after bread prices hit their peak. Food didn't cause the revolution the way a spark causes a fire. Food was the fire. The Women's March on Versailles, 7,000 women walking 12 miles in the rain, was explicitly a bread protest. Ordinary women in wet bonnets and aprons, some holding bread loaves impaled on pikes. Not a metaphor. A bread protest made visible at full human scale. So the revolution erupts. Heads literally roll. And somehow, the greatest chef in France not only survives, he thrives. How does a man cook his way through a regime that's guillotining everyone his food was made for? The answer is Talleyrand. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord served as a bishop under the monarchy, a diplomat under the Revolution, a foreign minister under Napoleon, and a kingmaker at the Congress of Vienna. He changed sides 4 times. He outlasted everyone. And he understood something most politicians never grasp. A great dinner is more persuasive than a great argument. Talleyrand hired Carême and famously told Napoleon that France's greatest diplomatic weapon was its cuisine. He wasn't being poetic, he meant it operationally. Foreign ambassadors who arrived hostile left the table charmed, full, and slightly confused about why they felt so warmly toward France. Carême was the weapon. The kitchen was the embassy. Think about that for a second. The revolution had just beheaded the aristocracy for their excess, and the new ruling class, Napoleon's generals, the nouveau riche, the foreign envoys, immediately started throwing the same lavish dinners. Power doesn't change its table manners, it just changes who's sitting at the table. The revolution changed who held the fork, not the fork itself. But Carême's most revealing moment isn't cooking for a French emperor. It's what happens when he ends up in the kitchen of France's great rival. Tsar Alexander I, St. Petersburg. Carême arrives expecting to be the most sophisticated person in the room. A Frenchman bringing civilization to the frozen East. What he finds instead genuinely shocks him. Russian aristocratic cuisine is extraordinary. Lavish in ways he hadn't anticipated. The ingredients, the techniques, the scale. None of it matched the barbaric rival France had imagined. His assumption of superiority crumbles almost immediately into fascination. This is where Carême's obsession shifts. He'd spent his career building individual masterpieces, each dinner a singular event. Now he wants something bigger, to capture all of it. The sources, the techniques, the underlying logic of French cuisine. Written down, organized and published so the whole architecture of the art form could survive him. He writes 5 volumes. He codifies the mother sources, the foundational basis from which all French cooking descends. He systematizes the kitchen brigade, the hierarchy of stations that professional kitchens still use today. He designs the chef's toque as a mark of professional identity. He doesn't just cook haute cuisine, invents it as a unified discipline. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange. Carême's obsession with order, hierarchy, and codified systems is the exact same obsession that drove the revolutionaries who destroyed the world he cooked for. He didn't escape the French Revolution. He absorbed it. And then he cooked it. Before the revolution, French cooking was served à la française. Everything on the table at once. 20 dishes arriving simultaneously in a visual explosion of abundance. It didn't matter if the soup was cold or the sauce had broken. The point was the spectacle. The point was that a man could look at his table and see power reflected back at him. Carême championed something different. Service à la Russe. Courses arriving in sequence. Each dish timed to its peak moment. Food evaluated on its own terms. Flavor, technique, execution. Not on how impressive the table looked from across the room. Quality over spectacle. Merit over theater. That is revolutionary ideology on a plate, literally. The Enlightenment's core argument that things should be judged rationally on their actual merit, not on inherited status and theatrical display. Carême was cooking it. The French Revolution reorganized politics by that principle. Carême reorganized dinner by the same one. Whether he knew it or not, he was finishing what the revolution started. Carême died in 1833. He was 48 years old. His contemporaries wrote that he was burnt out by the flame of his genius and the heat of his ovens. The actual cause was almost certainly decades of chronic charcoal inhalation. 19th century kitchens ran on open fires, and the smoke never fully cleared. He spent his whole career breathing it. He knew the kitchens were destroying his lungs. He kept working anyway. The boy who survived by sleeping in a fireplace was ultimately killed by fire. There's no tidy lesson in that. It's just true, and it sits with you. Here's what gets buried in every version of this story. Carême is always framed as the chef who cooked for power. But look at what he actually built. He took the chaotic, secretive, guild-protected recipes of aristocratic France, knowledge deliberately kept locked away, and he wrote it all down. Organized it, published it. Anyone could buy his books. Anyone could learn. He took the most exclusive cuisine on earth and handed it to the public. The boy the aristocracy once fed table scraps didn't just survive the revolution, he finished it. One published recipe at a time. That kid in the fireplace on the Rue Saint-Honoré, the one whose father told him the world was large and walked away. He didn't just escape hunger. He rewired how an entire civilization thinks about food. The French Revolution is remembered for the guillotine, but its most durable export wasn't a political ideology. It was dinner, and the next time you see French cuisine on a menu, or watch a chef work a kitchen brigade, or eat a meal where courses arrive in sequence, you're looking at the fingerprints of an 8-year-old abandoned on a Paris street in 1792.